My name is James Blitz. I'm leader writer on the Financial Times newspaper, former defense editor and political editor. I've been on the paper for about 25 years. And it is a great pleasure to be able to chair and also participate in this discussion about, first and foremost, the Strategic and Defence Security Review that was published at the start of the week, the latest in the 5-year cycle of reviews, one which comes at a very important moment when, of course, not only are there significant security threats coming from all sorts of quarters, from Russia and so on, but of course in a week and on a day which is also seeing the Prime Minister making the case in the House of Commons for enhanced military action by the UK, not only over Iraq but also over Syria. So there is a great deal to discuss. And it's my pleasure also to, apart from introducing myself, to introduce the two speakers who absolutely do not need any introduction. The first is Michael Clarke, Professor Michael Clarke, Director General of RUSI, and the second is Professor Malcolm Chalmers, who is not only with RUSI but also, in my view, one of the leading, if not the leading, defence economists in this country. I would like to say right at the outset, I gather, Michael, this is your final public appearance as Director General of RUSI, and I think things will be said later. But may I start off by saying that as a journalist, as somebody that's followed defence, I have absolutely valued every conversation we've had over many years. I have written so many pieces where I felt a great deal more confident saying something after I'd spoken to you. And so I would like to say right at the outset, it's a very great pleasure to be here on your final public appearance. And Malcolm, may I also say, there have been quite a few FT leaders recently that have got a little bit of your stamp on them, but anyway, I will leave it at that. Michael, please, please start off and give us your spiel.
James, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. So it seems very appropriate that as outgoing Director General, I get the chance to talk about the SDSR that was published on Monday. And we thought we'd just do some headlines and then open it up to further discussion. And I wanted to deal with some of the military aspects of it, and Malcolm will say more about the broader aspects and some of the economic sides of it. One of the things that's pretty clear is that it's the first election since 1982 in which defence has featured, and the general election made a difference. The SDSR and the financial settlement that's been made certainly owes quite a lot to electioneering and the outcome of the elections and the commitments that were made in the election. That's actually very interesting. Part of this SDSR, published on Monday, clearly is to get the 2010 SDSR back on track. The aspirations of 2010 to create Force 2020, to achieve what they wanted to achieve by then, had been knocked off course a bit by further economic problems. And so some of it's to get that back on track. But of course, in doing that, it still suffers from the same structural questions that surrounded the 2010 SDSR. So, there will be gaps until 2020. The things that are good about this review, and there are many things that are good about it, will not really come on stream until 2020 or thereafter. The budget will still be tight, despite the fact that the settlement is a lot better than Defence expected it to be. There's still vagueness on dates for in-service dates and dates by which equipment will be ordered. And of course, there's this issue of personnel. Will the personnel be there? Will the skills base be there to actually make the most of the equipment that is ordered? So all of those things were inherent in 2010, which was a review undertaken in the teeth of a severe economic crisis. And when people said the 2010 was not strategic, the exercise was not strategic, well, in a way it was strategic. The strategy in 2010 was to maintain a AAA credit rating. That was the overwhelming national priority, and everything else took precedence. Everything else had to stand behind that. That took precedence. So here is the 2015 review, which is more genuinely strategic, and a series of big questions have been asked. So two features of it seem to me to be very important from a strategic point of view. The first feature is that it is genuinely more integrated. This review is driven by the centre, and I think the process has been much better than in 2010. In 2010, the process was quick and ad hoc and under great pressure. This time, the process has been much smoother. It has seemed less controversial because it's been handled better. And the process, it has been driven from the centre. It was driven from the centre in 2010, but it was driven from the centre under particular circumstances. This has been driven from the centre. And it does make some strategic choices. And so Oliver Letwin is in charge of the will oversee the implementation of the review. 7 special units have been established within the National Security Council, which he's responsible for overseeing, to implement all the things that are put into this review. And some of the settlement is going to be covered by 11 billion in efficiency savings. And that is buried at the bottom of page 81. 11 billion in efficiency savings. Well, that's a great thing if you can do it, and Oliver Letwin doubtless will be onto it. But clearly, this is a review which is national and it is strategic. We can agree or disagree about the strategy, but I don't think we can complain that it has been done in a fragmented or a sectionalized way. The fact that cyber features in it so prominently has been well trailed and is quite important. 1.9 billion extra on cyber, taking the cyber budget for the next 5 years up to spending on cyber, government spending up to 3.2 billion, and that runs throughout the review. And then the review talks about full spectrum deterrence, and deterrence features, again, you can see this kind of centrality of the way it's been done. Deterrence features throughout the review. It's not just about the successor to the Vanguard class submarines. And the review is divided into these 3 big sections of protect, project, and promote. To protect, to project power, and to promote. Oh, it's always alliteration. I never know whether this penchant for alliteration arises in the civil service because of a classical education or because they just read too many tabloid newspapers. But anyway, protect, project, and promote. And so, in a sense, the services are divided into those particular requirements. So the first thing that I think is good about the review is that it is a much more integrated review and is I think, relatively successfully integrated review than was certainly the case in the past. And it's made a reality of what was more of an aspiration in 2010 because there's been some time to do it. The second major feature, I think, which is really what I wanted to say most about, is that I think there is a military, is an evolution of military thinking between the lines here. And you can see, although part of this review is getting 2010 back on track, another part of it is evolving to a different sort of military strategy. And it's partly based on the concept in the review, Joint Force 2025. In 2010, we had Future Force 2020. Now, 5 years later, we're talking about Joint Force 2025. And that, I think, it rests on, I think, 2 big evolutions or 2 big aspects of evolution that run through it. The first is that there is, if you like, it's not a return to traditional warfighting, but an acceptance of the need to structure for complex, high-tempo war-fighting operations at some scale. And you can see that there's that move back in the thinking behind what the armed services are doing and what they expect to be capable of doing after 2020. And it's partly based on the relative success of the Joint Forces Command concept, which has made a difference and is actually affecting the thinking, I think, throughout, certainly at the top and throughout the structuring of the armed forces. And so this sense that we've spent, since the end of the Cold War, we have gone light. We've had expeditionary forces doing very light operations in fairly sustained peacekeeping, muscular peacekeeping, peace support operations, and in some cases, counterinsurgency. Now the Army is, as it were, returning to a divisional structure. The CGS is very keen that the Army should structure around the ability of a division through partly his land joint strike concept. But a division is the unit big enough to integrate all of the other things, apart from war fighting, strategic communications, foreign aid, intelligence, all of the things that you need to actually fight in a bigger, across a bigger scenario. And so 3 division will be able to choose from 4 brigades, 2 armoured infantry brigades, 2 strike brigades, so any 3 of those, 3 from 4, to create a division which is a 2025 aspiration for high-tempo, complex war fighting. And an expeditionary force that will be capable of 50,000 troops. So in theory, we used to say 30,000 troops should be available for expeditionary operations. The SDSR now said that should be 50,000, and that's pretty ambitious. I mean, that's more than went to Operation Granby in 1991, more than went to Operation Telic in 2003. So we're planning for, as it were, at least that level of operation sometime after 2025. So the Army is very clearly structured for that. The Navy gets its 2 carriers and the requisite air wings that will go with an alternating carrier and possibly two carriers at sea together in certain circumstances is possible. The Navy also goes back to serious anti-submarine warfare operations, although with a smaller number of units. The maritime patrol aircraft, interestingly, I mean, this has been one of the great controversies. That was the issue that I always said would be the Chequers Saturday afternoon issue. You know, all defence reviews the big issues end up at Chequers on a Saturday before the review is published, and that's democracy. That's when the Prime Minister and 3 or 4 other people make the big decisions about the trade-offs between this or that. And I don't know if that was the case, but I bet it was, on the whole MPA. But the point about the MPA, the P8 aircraft, is that is sufficient for, it's about Russian submarines and Russian submarines operating a long way away from the United Kingdom. It's quite a big investment in future thinking about the strategic challenges. It's not just about MPA as a capability, it's about top-of-the-range MPA to actually cover the deep, far Atlantic against the best, the peer country of Russia. And of course the decision on Trident, which confirms what we all assume, which is that the main gate decision coming up next year might be scaled in a different way, but certainly there's no sense that the government's going to go back on it. And the RAF, 9 squadrons are committed, 2 squadrons of F-35, 7 squadrons of Typhoon, some of which will be maintained to give the RAF 9 squadrons. But the most important thing, I think, for the RAF is the I-STAR capabilities and the transport capabilities. Again, they won't really come on stream until after 2020, but these enablers will give the RAF what it needs. Now, the 2 big issues in all of this, one is that all of this is relatively ambitious. You can see within this the United Kingdom going back to war fighting at divisional, maritime task group, air wing level in a fairly convincing way as far as the technologies are concerned. The issue is still scale. We're still talking about small absolute numbers. The 8 Type 26s, which are guaranteed, yes, there'll be 8 of them, but there'll be 5 new forms of more modular ships. So it's not going to be 13 Type 26s, it's 8 Type 26s and 5 other ships. So yes, there'll be 13 ships, but of the Type 26s, for the ASW role, for the anti-aircraft role, 8 of them. Our absolute numbers are still small. And so these ambitions will have to be, as it were, put forward. They'll have to be achieved in a situation where we can't afford any mistakes. That's always been the case for British operations in the last 20-odd years. And the second issue is the personnel issue. Again, the uplifts in personnel are small by comparison with what the services think they will probably need, particularly for the Navy and the Air Force, and we know that more will have to be done there. But that's the first big aspect of switch, of the military switch. And the thing that accompanies that, the second thing, is that there's nothing in this SDSR about counterinsurgency, nothing about COIN. It's all about counterterrorism. And that's interesting, and it is a move from the expectation of counterinsurgency towards the expectation of more CT. And this is where you can see the integration of thinking actually comes through and is valuable. And so, as we know, with Trail, the security and intelligence agencies get an extra 1,900 staff, which is a 15% uplift in their staff. The police, SO15 in particular, are getting pretty well what they asked for in terms of digital media exploitation, being able almost to double the number of SO15 officers abroad, more capabilities in biometrics and so on. The decision on police pay, on police funding, yesterday was very, very interesting. Again, there's some hostages to fortune there. Local authorities will end up paying more for policing, and 350 million of savings will have to be achieved somewhere else in the back office functions. But nevertheless, that side of it can be regarded as fairly well integrated. Drones, 20 more drones. The Protector drone is actually Predator B, but it'll be called the Protector drone. The most interesting aspect of that is that these Predator B drones will be certified for flight in Europe. They will meet the requirements for flying inside Europe. And that tells us something. It's quite important. It's a very important aspect. Troops, 10,000 troops instead of 5,000 will be on standby to help with incidents in the United Kingdom. Obvious consequence of the Paris attacks and the possibility of marauding attacks. I don't think we will expect to see 10,000 troops turned out on the streets. I mean, that would be a big move. We go for that much more reluctantly than is the case in France or Belgium, who've got gendarmerie traditions. But 10,000 troops could release more police to be on the streets. They could do all sorts of useful things so that armed police could be on the streets and other police. So I think as a backup, as a backfill, That's an interesting number. Special Forces role, another 2 billion spent on Special Forces over the next 5 years. And again, that assumes more CT work abroad, but I think it may also assume a fair bit more CT work at home. We've got no concrete indications of that, but I'd be surprised if it didn't. And then infantry battalions. The SDSR does say on page 31 that the infantry battalions will make an increased contribution to CT and building stability overseas. The building stability overseas we all knew about, but an increased contribution to counter-terrorist operations. Doesn't specify whether that's overseas or at home, but it would be logical to believe that it might be at home as well. And the final point is that a lot is made at different points in the review about British-French cooperation. And that, again, is partly, I think, driven by the Paris attacks, but also by the Prime Minister's commitment to cooperate with France on technology, on CT, on intelligence sharing, on new drones, the UCAV concept. There's a big impetus here at the CT level on Anglo-French cooperation. So I think between the lines here, there's some quite big shifts taking place, but we will still need time for these things to work themselves through into 2025. But the political ambition to use them may actually predate the real achievement of these capabilities on the ground. My final point is that if there is a vote to leave the European Union next year, then everything I've said is irrelevant. There is a nightmare scenario which we used to regard as a joke, but is not now a joke. And this is the way the scenario works. Now, I'm not predicting this. I'm certainly not hoping for it. But it's more than just a trivial possibility. It's a 20% chance. It's not a 2% chance. I'd say it's a 20-25% chance. The refugee crisis, renewed crisis for the euro, has a real impact on thinking about the European Union in Britain in the run-up to a referendum. The referendum is lost by the pro-camp, so Britain votes, despite itself, to leave the European Union. That immediately triggers a vote on Scottish independence, which the Scottish nationalists might win. Immediately, the Prime Minister resigns, Conservative Party splits. We go into, as it were, a decade of constitutional crisis and political crisis. If that is the case, I'm absolutely not predicting it, but it cannot be ruled out. If that is the case, then everything in defence goes back up for grabs. And we'll wonder what we were doing standing here speaking so rationally about it. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. Malcolm.
Well, since Mike is still my boss, I have to start by saying that I agree with everything that he said. And he puts it much more elegantly than I could. So let me just start by raising a metaphorical glass to Mike. You have given me so much over these last years. It's been a marvelous pleasure to work for you as director, and I think we all hope that in the years to come we'll be able to work with you in other capacities. I know Mike is very coy about what he's going to do next and deserves a break from all this madness that we're involved in. But I also know that our business is a pretty addictive one, and he won't stay away for too long. He is too keen and eager to get involved in these really important questions that we all deal with day to day to stay away for very long. And I look forward to the day when he's back in the policy community making the sort of contribution he's made over so many years. The second thing I would do is just raise a metaphorical glass actually to those who were involved in the SDSR over the last few months across government. It's been a pretty grueling task, I think, for all of them, getting this in the shape it is. And I think they've done a pretty good job, but it must be pretty disheartening to do all that for months and months and create this really thick document, and then to have people like myself and Mike stand up at the end of it and pick holes in it. So my heart does go out to you. What I would say, though, is wasn't it possible to get a sexier title? The title, for those who don't know, of this document is National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review 2015, A Secure and Prosperous United Kingdom. Well, okay, but it's not going to grab the headlines, perhaps deliberately, perhaps it was designed for that purpose. In terms of my headline for this document, for this review, I do think it is an important step in restoring Britain's reputation as a serious defence and security power, in large part because expectations were so low. Because I think until really quite recently, the expectation was that this review would be a repetition of the experience in 2010. We, after all, had a Chancellor with a commitment to drastic austerity on a scale comparable for government as a whole with the 2010 experience, and people, I think, extrapolated that to defence and security. And yesterday, we saw that the overall austerity package is much reduced, that an awful lot of money has been hidden in the Office of Budget Responsibilities SOFA to be drawn out today, and that's very welcome not only for defence and security but for other parts of government. So I think that's very welcome for security and for the UK's reputation, and I hope in the months to come some of that diminution of the UK's international reputation will be affected. But I'll come back to that more towards the end. And I think it's well worth a read, actually, of the document for a lot of the detail. I mean, those involved in different parts of defence and security in the country will pick up particular bits of detail. Mike has picked up some, I'll pick up others. But there's an awful lot in there, and it's well worth reading. It's almost breathless in the number of new initiatives and plans and joined-up councils and committees. It's going to be a very busy period for planners. I suppose you'd expect planners to propose lots of plans, and they've done precisely that. And I think that's welcome. And it does, I think, send the right signals in terms of cross-departmental working, in terms of a focus on internationalism. The Defence Secretary, speaking at RUSI not so long ago, talked about the defence part of this being international design, and I think that's absolutely right. There's more focus on deterrence, and I think that's very welcome. We need, I think, one of the messages of this review should be that our military doesn't have to be engaged in operations to be doing good. We can get value out of our armed forces because of their deterrence value, because they prevent conflict rather than fighting them. And of course, that's particularly relevant because of the new emphasis placed, I think rather explicitly, on the potential for conflict with Russia. Now, the review makes it very clear, and I quote, that it's still highly unlikely that NATO will be engaged in a direct conflict with Russia. But given the potential impact of such a conflict, contributions to collective deterrence of Russia remain an important part of this review, more important than they were 5 years ago or even perhaps 2 years ago. I think, to be charitable, I would tend to aim off some of the hubris in some of the parts of the review, perhaps the earlier parts, which give an impression of the UK being, I think, rather more powerful and influential than it is. I think sometimes when we talk about Britain being the world's leading soft power, a power which is central to every international organisation going, well, we're not central to the European Union. We're already a semi-detached member of the European Union, and there I think some of the key decisions about the Eurozone, about the migration crisis are not being made in London because of those choices we've made. So I think we have to aim off a little bit about some of that rhetoric. The reality of the UK strategic situation that is that in many crises, many security problems, we're as much, if not more, a taker of security as a maker of security. We can make a contribution, but even in relation to the current Ukraine crisis, we are not the main player in the diplomatic process. That's one where Germany and to some extent France play a much more influential role. That's a statement of fact. It's not a statement that we should be involved in all those processes. But I think sometimes, I hope our decision makers have a correct appreciation of the UK's position in international affairs, which is perhaps rather different from some of the rhetoric in this document. Mike has mentioned, I think, some of the main issues. I think I would essentially repeat his statement that one of the, I think, strengths of this review is it's able to, it gives the message that our capabilities need to point in more than one direction at once. We need to have forces that are capable of dealing with non-state threats, ISIL if you like today, but it could be something entirely different in a couple of years' time. And the new investments in ISTAR, special forces equipment, drones and so on are, I think, very important in that regard. But we also need large investments in dealing with potential for peer states, submarines, SSNs and SSBNs, ASW aircraft, and so on. We need both, and I think the review tries to strike that important balance. I think it's welcome, actually, the review, much more than the last one, talks about geography, both in relation to allies and partners. There's actually quite a useful section which describes in a reasonably joined up way how the UK views particular countries, and diplomatically, of course, but sometimes one can read between the lines where the concerns are, where the greatest concerns are, and that's very welcome, because understandably the national security risk assessment itself is confidential and would be a very undiplomatic document to publish were the government foolish enough to do so. So that's, I think, very, and I won't repeat anything else that Mike says in relation to the military choices. I think in capability terms and financial terms, I would characterize this most of all as a steady as she goes review. This is not a review that introduces step changes in UK capabilities. The numbers of armed forces personnel will remain more or less what they are now. The numbers of ships and combat aircraft more or less where they are now. There are some up arrows in some areas, some down arrows in others. A very big improvement compared with what was anticipated, but this is not the UK rearming on a large scale. Indeed, the budgetary settlement is more or less identical to that which has been in planning assumptions since the 2010 SDSR, which was based on the assumption of a 1% equipment growth after 2015 per annum and 0% for the rest. And that's more or less where we are today. And again, we're on track to fill the two biggest capability gaps left by the SDSR on the equipment side, the carrier and maritime patrol aircraft, by the end of the decade or shortly thereafter. So again, very much on track there. As the spending review made clear yesterday, we're talking about a 3.1% real increase in the defence budget over the next 4 years, which is actually, in terms of annual growth rates, pretty comparable with how the defence budget grew, the core defence budget grew between 1998 and 2010. So we're basically going back to the long-term trend of the defence budget after the immediate post-Cold War period, right up until the financial crisis. So we're getting back on track, stabilising the defence budget, and it's also welcome, I think, perhaps because of the SDSR nature as a joined-up process, that we've seen increased investment in international development, in the intelligence and security agencies, and although this was one of the several rabbits pulled out of George Osborne's hat yesterday, we've also seen protection for the police budget, for the National Crime Agency, and the Foreign Office. I think if you'd simply read George Osborne's speech yesterday, you would be puzzled as to what he was actually cutting. I mean, for an austerity budget, it was remarkably generous, and defence and security sector has benefited from that. But I think where it's different from that period between 1998 and 2010 is that reading between the lines, looking at the numbers, there has been a significant shift of resources from personnel to equipment. The announcement by the Prime Minister of a significant uplift in the equipment budget over the next 10 years, on my calculations, means that the growth rate for equipment spending is going to go from 1% in real terms per annum to around 2% in real terms per annum. And that's pretty significant. It reflects the cost pressures on the equipment program. But it's only possible to fund 2% growth in the equipment budget with a total budget only growing at 0.6, 0.7% per annum by ruthlessly squeezing the personnel budget. And the fact that the government has not been willing to make any cuts in military personnel numbers. It means that those personnel cost savings have to come from a 30% reduction in civilian personnel, and there's a big question mark about who will do the jobs those civilian personnel are currently doing, since the front line is not going to be changed. Is it going to be contractors? How much money will that save? Are some of those tasks going to be remilitarized? And what does that mean in terms of economic efficiency? And it's also the case, and very importantly, I think, that it's only, and this is actually applies to the rest of government as well as the military and security services. It's only possible to make those personal savings because of the commitment to restrain military pay increases to 1% per annum every year for the next 4 years at least, at a time when, according to the statement yesterday, the average earnings in the economy as a whole will be growing at almost 4% per annum. So if the government had kept the commitment to keep military pay comparable with that in the private sector at where it is now, the same comparison, it would have cost something of the order, almost £1 billion per year extra by the end of the decade. So really, this is serious money we're talking about in terms of saving on the pay bill. I think, finally, in terms of detailed commentary, I would only say this, that we need to know a little bit more about the timing of some of these equipment purchases. Some of the most important debates in the review within the Ministry of Defence were about which bits of kit should arrive first, and not least whether the maritime patrol aircraft is the urgent requirement and we're buying off the shelf so we can get that rapidly, or indeed whether the requirement to have a fully equipped aircraft carrier by the early 2020s is a priority. And I suspect that there's been a balancing there. We need to know a bit more information. I have been told, others may be able to confirm, that the first operational MPA will be 2019, which is perhaps a bit later than some people had thought. But there's sort of real issues of timing there. And perhaps the biggest, it certainly shocked to me, perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, I didn't see it coming, was the announcements on Successor submarine. Some of you may remember in 2006, when the first decision was made by the government to begin the Successor programme. At that time, the government announced that although these submarines were only designed for a 25-year lifetime, the government decided to give a 5-year life extension to 30 years. Then in 2010, the coalition government looked at it again and decided, actually, we can extend the lifetime of these submarines by another 4 years, from 2024 to 2028 for the first new submarine to come in. And now, in the SDSR, the government has announced that actually, no, it's not going to be 2028, it's going to be the early 2030s. So we seem to have a pattern here where every 5 years, the government extends the lifetime of the existing ballistic missile submarines by about 4 years. Now, I don't know how long this pattern will continue, but it's certainly beginning to look like a pattern. And as in the past, I think, one of the consequences of stretching the programme, it's certainly not saving money. The cost estimate for the Successor submarine has gone from 25 billion cash to 31 billion cash plus 10 billion contingencies. So now the document makes it, I think, rather clear that the Treasury is not at all satisfied with the way this programme is being managed. It's going to introduce radically new, though not very well defined, management arrangements for the programme, and we'll see how that all works out. Certainly, it's not normal in cost estimates that I've seen for major defence programmes to separate out the contingency number from the rest of the budget. So there are lots of questions in relation to Successor. Just as we thought the Successor issue was done and dusted and we'd have a main gate decision and we'd move straight into production in the near future, it all seems to be back on the drawing board. And there's not going to be a main gate, or not going to be a single main gate in relation to Successor any longer, so that's another surprise. So finally, a lot of questions still to answer, lots of time to do so. The big picture is I think this review has stabilised the UK's defence and security capabilities, and that will do the UK's reputation a lot of good. But in the end, the UK's reputation as a serious international security player doesn't only depend on the resources we put into security, it also depends on how we perform in relation to operational commitments, and the Syria vote will be important there, but also what actually happens in Syria and Iraq, success there, however we define that. And of course, finally, the biggest risk of all, and here, again, I agree entirely with Mike, the risks involved in the EU referendum for the UK's international reputation should not be underestimated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Michael, you asked me also to say a few words. First of all, I think we've heard two terrific expert commentaries on SDSR, and there's no way that I'm going to match that level of knowledge. You've asked me to say something a bit about the political and the sort of political context of SDSR. I think that for the media, for those looking at it from the outside, I think the central question is, and I think you've touched on it, both of you, is how much is this week's statement, the SDSR, going to help change international perceptions of Britain's security role? How much is this going to help create the sense, once again, the kind of front-rank power, the first ally of the US that we've seen over so many decades? And it's an important question because over the last 5 years, the perception has clearly deepened, especially in the US, that Britain has stepped back from a frontline role, and you will be aware of a whole range of developments that have led to that. SDSR 2010 pushed through significant cuts in MOD spending, cutting the budget by about 8% a year in real terms. We saw a significant lack of capabilities in operations, notably the absence of a carrier in the 2011 operation over Libya. There was the debacle over the August 2013 Commons vote on whether to have a short, sharp strike against Assad over his use of chemical weapons. There have been perceptions brought out in the Commons Defence Select Committee report recently that we haven't been pulling our weight in the anti-ISIS coalition, and as has been said, debate has raged and is continuing to rage over whether we will stay in the European Union. There's also been a perception that France and Germany, while we are stepping back, have become more forceful players on the international stage. France in Central African Republic and Mali and Syria, Germany under Merkel, much stronger actor in diplomacy than Germany has traditionally been, especially as regards Ukraine, where Merkel has been a most important interlocutor. And I think the question that I would ask is whether SDSR draws a line, if you like, draws a line under 5 years in which we were stepping back and takes us now into a new phase where we are going back to our former role. And that's a question. There's certainly a much more positive tone about defence and security from David Cameron and from the government than there has been up till now. And that's inevitable. We have got real security threats, notably the question of Putin's operations in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, the threat from ISIS and so on, and that has clearly guided the tone. At the same time, as I think both Michael and Malcolm have said, we need to be sceptical about many aspects of the substance in SDSR. Clearly there has been an important filling of capability gaps. There was always going to be, after 2015, as I understand it, a sense that having cut, we were then going to grow defence again, and we're on track once more to do that. But clearly there isn't some huge new pot of cash that is suddenly being thrown at defence. Much of the extra funding for equipment appears to be coming out of, as Malcolm has said, out of cutting civil servants inside the MOD. So there's a lot of switching of cash around. So it stabilizes, as Malcolm says. It is not a significant new rearming of the UK. My thought, though, is that if what is positive here is going to be followed through, there need to be a range of other developments, a whole load of other things over the next few years, and Malcolm touched on them at the very end of his speech, need to happen in terms of operations. the first question, if we're to consolidate in the UK the sense that we are once more a frontline player, the government clearly needs to win the vote on Syria, which is coming up next week. More than that, the Prime Minister needs to be judged, and he's made his statement today, but he needs to be judged to have made a real and serious case for enhancing UK operations over the Iraq-Syria area. So that is a very important area of judgment. The second thing that is going to be needed is the UK has to win this vote on Brexit. It's been said, it can't be stressed enough, and I suppose that's why I'm the third person to say it this morning, but it is a very close-run thing, and it's interesting that in his speech on the European referendum, the one he made a couple of weeks ago, in which he set out the terms of his negotiation with the EU, the Prime Minister stressed the importance that the EU membership plays in terms of security. And so he is now placing Britain's membership within that context, that actually it's important in terms of collaboration, say, over the Iranian nuclear program and sanctions, that kind of thing. It's very important that the government makes the case for membership, and that is one, and one convincingly. That will be important. A third area which I think is important, which hasn't been mentioned, is how we perform on counter-terrorism. I do think that something that is emerging in terms of the comparison between the UK and France is that if you look back over the 10 years back to 7/7, I think more and more the sense is that the British have done well. They have managed to contain a lot of the homegrown threat. It's very difficult, but nonetheless a lot of the right investments and strategies have been made. France, by contrast, appears to me more and more to be at the beginning of a long, long road in terms of dealing with the internal Islamist militant threat. Germany is also in the throes of a really serious crisis over migrants, which may yet threaten Angela Merkel herself. So there is a contrast there that is emerging, out of which the UK may come to be seen to have made the right decisions. What has not changed, and what is not reflected, what this review does not reflect at all, is any significant change in the British public's view of defence. That is my view. Britain still remains a highly, in the aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, the British public still remains highly reluctant to see operations on the ground. What General Horton, the CDS, talked about in his, I think it was his Christmas RUSI lecture 2 years ago, the creeping aversion to risk remains very powerful, not only among the British public, but also in government. And my own view is that that has not particularly changed. The Chilcot report on Iraq will have far more resonance with the British public when it comes out. I think it is next year, summer of next year. Will have far more resonance with the British public, I'm afraid, than SDSR. And that is an unfortunate factor. But, to end on a positive note, the hope must be that SDSR 2015 does mark the drawing of a line under 5 years in which the UK is seen to have stepped back, and that trend is now reversed.